Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sara Oloomi. Today I'm going to present a paper titled Parental Education and Skill Indicators of Children, which has an intergenerational, closely related to the previous session about socioeconomic status, which we will get into it in more details. Before starting, I want to thank AR team for providing valuable comments on the paper, which has improved the quality of this paper significantly. So thank you. And by intergenerational social mobility, we are more specifically actually looking at the association between family socioeconomic status and education and economic outcomes of their children, which I may call them adults during. Based on the literature, there are three main indicators of socioeconomic background, as we learned from previous session, including parental income, parental education, and parental occupation. PIAAC dataset provide parental education, so we use that as socioeconomic status. And this, just to give a motivation, this association is important because in the societies, especially with low mobility, it's expected actually to see very high correlation, high association between parental. So considering that in the context of adults from low socioeconomic status, so children coming from families with low socioeconomic status tend to stay in the cycle of disadvantage. So it will raise questions, and it will raise importance of some policy interventions that actually come and help in reducing this association to help all children, all adults to succeed in the society regardless of the socioeconomic status or their background. Also, another subject that we are going to address in this paper is the association between parental education and propensity to study STEM. And also, we know there is a big gender gap in STEM. So another interesting research question is to see are, for example, children from families with higher parental education, what is the gender gap in STEM in that category? Is it different? Is it going to reduce? So somehow to distinguish the impact of parental education on propensity to study STEM and related gender gap. More specifically, we are addressing the following research questions. The first one is, what are the ranges of absolute upward mobility in education in the US? And what do we mean by absolute mobility? Based on literature, it actually refers to the extent that people do better than their parents. So in order to do this comparison, we need to focus on one variable that we have information for both children and parents. So the variable we have is education. So that's why we study absolute mobility in education, to see to what extent educational outcomes of their children are more than their parents. Next question is about relative mobility. And relative mobility studies the extent to which an individual's chances are actually depend on his or her parents' status, such as education, in this research. So we are looking to see what is the extent of relative mobility in the US using both summary statistic and inferential statistic using regression analysis. And then we will see if this relative mobility varies by different segments of the population, such as by gender and different racial groups. Outcome of interest are actually the outcomes that we want to see, the impact on parental education on outcomes of their children. And these outcomes are education, employment status, occupational skills, cognitive skills, including literacy, numeracy, and problem solving. Last research question is about the association between parental education and propensity to study STEM and a related gender gap in STEM. Data used in this study is USPI 2012-2014 public use data, and variables that we used for outcome variables are repetitive, as I said in previous slide: cognitive skills, occupational related variables, including employment, earning, occupational skill classification, STEM. And main explanatory variable is parental education, and control variables are age groups, gender, language. Language means our individual says that are they native or learn English at the younger ages or older ages. Racial groups, urban, city, region, and in some of the specification, which I will talk about in the next slides. In some of the specification, we also include highest level of education and skilled occupation. About the specification, we used, as we talked, we use different outcome variables, and these different outcome variables have different structures, and based on different structures, we had to use different specification, different models for them. For example, employment get values of employed, unemployed, and out of labor force. So the best model we could use was multinomial logistic regression. For variables such as education, occupational skill, and earnings, these variables are ordinal. And for example, education changes from less than high school to high school and college. So it's like you can see an ordinal pattern. And occupational skill is unskilled, semi-skilled, blue collar, I guess, semi-skilled, white collar, and a skilled occupation. So again, this is ordinal. That's why we use ordinal logistic regression. And earnings. We actually transform earnings to different quartiles, and from the lowest to the highest. And that's why, again, it becomes ordinal, and we use that. A study STEM is 0-1, so binary logistic regression, and for literacy, numeracy, and problem solving, we use linear regression. So the first research question using summary statistics is absolute mobility, and the graph on the right shows that about 48% of individuals actually gain similar educational attainment as their parents, and 26% receive higher and 26% receive lower. And it shows that children tend to attain or gain similar education as their parents. On the left, you see that it's a division by different parental education. For the first category, with among individuals with college-educated parents, you see that 48% of them tend to have a college degree. In the second category, individuals with high school-educated parents, you see that 57% gain similar education as their parents. So it shows low mobility. People tend to attain similar education as their parents. But we see actually high upward mobility for the last category among individuals with less than high school education parents. You see that only 29% of individuals tend to attain similar education as their parents, but about 71% attain higher education. Actually, literature back up this finding, and it says that it's because many policy reforms and policy changes in education, mainly because of compulsory education, that increase enrollment rate significantly and reduce dropout rates also, again significantly. This slide is relative mobility, which is the association between parental education and different outcomes of their children. And the graph is just for one of the variables, but results are pretty similar across different variables. So you see that as problem solving from the lowest quartile increase to the highest quartile, you see that the proportion of individuals with college degree increases from 26% to 66%. So we see an exact similar pattern for all the variables. We see that adults with higher parental education, they have higher quartiles of literacy, numeracy, problem solving. They are more likely to have college degrees, be employed, earn higher quartiles of earnings, and be engaged in skilled occupations. Next slide actually is using studying relative mobility, but using the regression analysis. So here we see exactly similar results. We use parents with high school as a reference group, and we see that individuals with less than high school parental education receive the lower scores for literacy, numeracy, and problem solving compared to individuals with high school educated parents. And individuals with college educated parents receive significantly higher scores than individuals with high school educated parents. So the control variables in these regressions are age groups, gender, language, racial groups, urban city region, and also highest level of education attained. These are the results for education, skilled occupation, and earnings using ordinal logistic regression. Again, we see similar results. Here, coefficients are odds ratio. So comparing to 1, we see that individuals with less than high school receive the odds ratio less than 1. So they are less likely than individuals with a higher school to attain higher education, skilled occupation, and earnings, and vice versa for individuals with college degrees. When we add interaction with gender, we see that it's very interesting. It shows that when education of parents increase from high school to college, the additional effect is significantly higher for females compared to males for education and earnings. This result is important because it shows that it actually reduces gender gap in earnings. It shows that when parental education increases, actually among those individuals, gender gap in earning especially tends to be actually lower. Similar results actually with employees, so I skipped this one. And lastly, STEM. For STEM, the result might be a little bit unexpected. What we see is that the significant impact is less than 1. So what it says is that individuals with college-educated parents are about 13% less likely than individuals with high school educated parents to study STEM. And we didn't see any impact for parents with less than high school. So, and also we didn't find any impact by gender. One reason that we didn't pick up any impact, it might be because in STEM, number of observations are much lower and because of a lot of missing values. So maybe it reduces the precision of the estimates, and that might be the reason we couldn't pick up actually any effect here. So conclusion is there is a strong association between parental education and here family socioeconomic status, using parental education as an indicator or proxy on different outcomes of children education and economic outcomes. And we see that higher parental education actually helps in reducing gender gap in skilled occupations and also earnings. But we didn't find any impact of parental education on probability to study STEM as well as gender gap in STEM. And policy implication, the main and the most important policy implication is the importance of adult literacy and education. because it shows that not only this sort of education will improve the welfare of the adults, actually it will improve many education and economic outcomes of the next generation. Also, mixing the result of this study and literature review, it raises the importance of the policies that promote early intervention, because literature says that early life health and economic health and educational outcomes actually define later life education and labor market outcomes. So actually, that's why it's important. It shows the importance of the policies, especially in early intervention, to help children from especially low socioeconomic status to provide some sort of equal opportunities for everyone, for them to be able to succeed in the society regardless of their background. And one example of such policies can be Head Start, that they actually target low-income children and try to provide high-quality education for them. And lastly, we didn't find any relationship between parental education and propensity to study STEM. But again, mixing with the literature, what we see in the literature, maybe parental education directly doesn't have impact on STEM, propensity to study STEM. But actually, literature shows policies promoting higher parental involvement through education system can actually help in increasing propensity to study STEM and hopefully reducing gender gap in STEM. So that's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Sara. And now Meredith.
Can I just use the microphone?
You can do whatever you like.
Discussants decided we want to stand. Want to
Just
walk.
make sure that you're actually talking.
I think this is on, right?
Yeah.
So hello, and thank you so much for your paper. I enjoyed reading it. Gave me a lot to think about, and I was talking to my colleagues. And one of the things, I'm glad we ended with the policy implications, because that's kind of where I want to start a conversation. And when researchers are trying to communicate to policymakers and practitioners, it's a slightly different task than what we're used to doing when we research for other researchers. And I think that sometimes we don't even know what we're sitting on until we fully understand the conversation that policymakers are trying to have. And I think this paper is kind of a place where there are some hidden gems that, if picked out and polished a little bit differently, could fit into a conversation quite nicely. And so I kind of want to walk through what that might look like. So when we are trying to conduct research for policymakers and practitioners, the research must reflect their conversation. And that means the use of their terms has to match their expectations for those terms. It needs to match the population for whom they're trying to form policy. And that might mean that we're going to have to do a couple things different than what we might do if we're looking at something to inform theory and other research. We also, as researchers, need to look for new or ongoing conversations that overlap with our interest, hopefully. And we need to make sure that this area of conversation is still susceptible to research. So sometimes conversations have become so entrenched that we might not actually get listened to. So you kind of want something that's still susceptible. And it's really helpful if the conversation that policymakers are having starts to have some defined or emerging goals and some sort of clear terminology that you can decipher and then align your variables to, because they're not going to look at your variables. If you use the word STEM, they're going to think that means what they mean. So you need to make sure that your variables and how you're defining STEM matches their conversation, because they're not going to do the translation. And so luckily, there's a really hot conversation going on. In fact, the conversation kind of hit another bell this week on Tuesday, I think it was. And the conversation is around STEM. Okay, so back in 2015, there was a report that came out of NSF, the National Science Board, And it was a companion piece to the index of S and E indicators, I think is what they call it. And in that report, they mentioned, I tried to write the little quote, like what the goal needs to be is to build a STEM-capable workforce and this workforce is going to have a variety of pathways into various STEM occupations, and that there's a need for STEM readiness across the population to inspire innovation. And that just having people that are STEM ready is going to propel all fields forward. So it's not necessarily a clear pathway, like you study engineering, you become an engineer, you study social science, you become a social scientist. Sometimes you end up somewhere different, but they still use your talents, right? So they're exploring a little bit richer of a model of what it means to have people study STEM and why we want that. And at the end of that report, they mentioned that one of the things we should focus on is what kind of policies would be necessary to ensure all students and incumbent workers, regardless of race, ethnicity, gender, socioeconomic status, locale, and other demographic characteristics, have opportunities to embark on these workforce paths? So I hope you're starting to see the connection. And then on Tuesday, the White House put out an initiative to try and again focus on STEM. And they had 3 goals that they identified. One goal was to build strong foundations for STEM literacy, including computational thinking. They want to increase diversity, equity, and inclusion. And they want to prepare a STEM workforce. So, given this context, I think that part of your first research question and part of your second research question, if tweaked, could fit into their conversation. And so I want to just kind of highlight some of the tweaks that I think you and potentially others could take to really fit into what they mean. So the first thing is to make sure that we identify what they mean by STEM, and we use that definition. So in looking at how you were defining STEM, it seemed very focused on the T and the E, but not necessarily the S, because the S should include social sciences. And it also didn't seem to include a lot of healthcare, and that is really important to policymakers, making sure that there's a workforce ready to take care of that part of the workforce. So making sure that and that might also kind of explain why you had such a small count and some of the oddities, like women tend to be more drawn to social sciences and healthcare. So maybe it's not surprising that we're not in engineering. The other thing to think about is the population of policy interest. If the policy interest is on students and incumbent workers, then perhaps from the PIAAC data, you're looking at the millennials and like the late Gen Xers. The people that are older at sort of like mid or late career aren't going to be as policy relevant. So again, sort of tweaking your sample to fit their conversation. And then I think also paying a little bit more sensitivity to the levels of education. So some college, if that includes certificates, that's a policy interest, right? So we might want to be a little bit more sensitive to the individual's education outcome. And then also thinking of things in terms of, are people on track to meet milestones? So we, in your study, you looked at people and like a way to sort of group, you left the students out of some analyses, but that's really important to policymakers because they want to know, are people on track? So maybe thinking instead in terms of people who are NEET, that N-E-E-T, the not employed in education or training, so people that are completely out of the game versus the people that are on a track that could potentially build the STEM workforce. So anyway, thank you very much again.
Thank you very much for the comments.
Next, we'll hear from Elizabeth Tighe.
Okay, good afternoon. I am Liz Tighe. I'm an assistant professor at Georgia State University, and my team, I'd like to recognize Iris Feinberg, who unfortunately is here, but lost her voice, but she is sort of the workings behind this particular project, as well as Daphne Greenberg and Daphne's graduate student, Omni Talwar. So I'm going to be speaking today on the Writing Behavior Index and the Reading Behavior Index and their relations to literacy and PSTRE domains. The general purpose was to examine the relations between reading and writing behaviors, both at home and at work, for lower and higher skilled adults on the literacy and PSTRE domains. Specifically, I'm going to talk a little bit about just overall associations between those derived indices. And then we were particularly interested in low-skilled adults. And so we have a couple functional writing behaviors. So we're describing functional as skills used every day. And so particularly we're focusing on writing letters, emails, or memos, as well as filling in forms. And particularly we're interested in those categories in terms of differences by different demographics. So I'm not going to present all of these different demographics, but we did look at in our paper native language status, age, race, and job category. So as we all know, writing is a fundamental skill for adults to function in society, from as simple as filling in job applications and resumes to specific to low-skilled adults enrolled in adult literacy programs. They have a 45-minute essay to complete their GED test or their high school equivalency. There's not been work done on particularly writing behaviors, but also writing abilities for adults in relation to reading skills. But what we do know from work with K through 12 children is that there's a fairly strong relation between reading and writing skills. As I said before, it'd be great if PIAAC did actually have writing ability, but what's unique about PIAAC is that it provides information on these daily functional writing as well as reading behaviors, so things like filling in forms. I'm not going to talk about the reading today, but we did look at that as well in our paper, so things like reading directions and reading emails. Writing is typically thought of as a vehicle for learning, and particularly people switch from sort of learning to write and the mechanics of writing to what we call the writing to learn paradigm, where people are sort of writing to better understand a concept. And once you switch to the writing to learn paradigm, you're really promoting more critical thinking skills that are needed in further education as well as workplace. A recent meta-analysis with K through 12 children has found that engaging in writing to learn tasks resulted in academic achievement gains across a multitude of domains, so math, science, social studies, as well as literature. In addition, institutions of higher education have recognized the importance of writing in academic and professional settings, just based on the prevalence of remedial programs to help students to address writing gaps before taking more advanced college-level courses, as well as the prevalence of writing centers and individualized writing assistants, and also different courses that may be in any sort of discipline but have a heavy focus on writing in those different disciplines. The second piece to this is understanding writing in relation to digital environments. So in particular with our functional writing variables, there's a shift towards moving to online platforms for filling in forms. So it's also important to think about the relation between these writing behaviors and the PSTRE domain. At least among studies with children and adolescents, greater engagement with online platforms such as social media and blogs does lead to increased writing frequency. So we have three main questions. The first, just simply what are the relations among the writing behavior indices and the reading behavior indices both at home and at work? And we looked at this for the general U.S. household sample as well as specific to those who are low-skilled in literacy. We're defining low-skilled as below 276 or level 2 and below. Do the relations of functional writing behaviors vary by those demographic characteristics I had mentioned for adults with lower and higher literacy as well as lower and higher PSTRE skills? And are reading behaviors, literacy, and PSTRE predictive of writing behaviors at home and at work for adults? And is this relation moderated by literacy level? So we use both the continuous index, the derived index for the writing indices, as well as those specific functional writing questions of writing letters, emails, and memos, and filling in forms. So for the frequency responses, it ranged anywhere from 0, never, all the way to every day as a 5. And then again, we classified low and high literacy and PSTRE levels. So low skilled was considered below 276 in literacy and below 291 in PSTRE. And then for our background, we did native language, which I'll present on today, age and tenure bands, race, which I'll talk a little bit about today, and job category. So for research question 1, just establishing whether there is a relation between reading and writing indices. So what you'll see here is I put all adults, or I should say low adults, in green. And there are relations among reading and writing indices both at home and at work. And in particular, the strongest relations were between writing at work and reading at work, as well as writing at home and reading at home. But there is not a difference in magnitude of these relations for sort of the general household sample as compared to those who are low skilled in literacy. As I said, I'm going to touch on a couple of these functional skills. So we wanted to really delve more into the functional skills. And so we looked at writing letters, emails, or memos at work versus at home. And what you'll see here is I have low and high PSTRE and low and high literacy, as well as native and non-native status. And so particularly for those low in literacy, you'll see that native speakers report more frequent writing emails at work. And similarly for native speakers, low in PSTRE. But it's actually flipped when you get to high skills. So for high skills, non-native speakers actually report a greater frequency of writing letters or emails at work relative to non-native speakers. At home, we only get relations for those in literacy. So for those who are low in literacy, again, the same pattern of results. Native speakers are reporting greater writing letters, emails, or memos. And again, for high literacy, non-native speakers are reporting more frequency. Functional skills by race. I don't want to talk about all of these, but what I do want to highlight is for those who were low in literacy, and this held true both across our writing letters, emails, and memos at work, home, as well as filling in forms. Those who are low in literacy, the Hispanic racial group reported the lowest frequency across all of those. In terms of research question 3, predicting writing behavior indices at home and at work. So these were 2 separate regression models. I will say I had said that we were going to look if whether the reading, writing behaviors were moderated by literacy level, and they were in fact not. So instead we just put it in as 4 predictors. So for writing behavior indices at home, the only significant predictors were your PSTRE skills and your reading behaviors at home. And similarly for writing behaviors at home, again, PSTRE, and then reading at work. And so it was context specific. So it tended to be only your reading behaviors at work and your writing behaviors at work, or reading and writing behaviors at home. So overall, we find relations exist between reading and writing behaviors at home and at work for the general population, as well as for low-skilled adults in literacy. We do find important differences among the different demographic groups across all of our different variables. I put specifically here writing letters and emails, particularly differences within and between low and high skilled native and non-native speakers, and then across all racial categories as well as age bands, low skilled adults reported lower frequencies in general. And we also found that PSTRE and reading behaviors specific to context are predictive of writing behaviors. However, we weren't able to account for that much variance, which sort of leaves it open to what else could be contributing to this. In terms of practical implications, strengthening reading and writing skills together in adult education may help to improve academic outcomes. Improving low-skilled adults' writing behaviors, but more importantly, their writing abilities may help them actually achieve GEDs and ultimately achieve better economic outcomes. And developing technology, since PSTRE was an important predictor as tools for writing instruction, can help adults at varying literacy and PSTRE levels increase their academic and workplace skills. Thank you.
Thanks, Liz, and I apologize for mispronouncing your name. And now, Dolores.
Okay, thanks for this opportunity to discuss this paper. It's very good to see the focus on writing, which is an overlooked area in adult literacy, but it's essential for civic and workforce participation in a digital world, as well as academic progress in secondary and post-secondary education. It's a very overlooked area, so glad you were able to turn to this. I think a lot of my comments here are going to be about PIAAC more broadly construed than just this paper. But the study uses PIAAC's literacy and technological problem-solving responses along with self-reported frequencies of reading behaviors to predict self-reported writing behaviors. So the focus for me here is on the fact that it's self-report data. To me, it's a little controversial for several reasons, but the most important one for me is the metacognitive aspect of this. Not only for myself, presumably I'm somewhat proficient in literacy, possibly, but we're working with individuals who don't have such a strong academic history. There is some literature to suggest that they're not the best informants on their own processes and behaviors. They may overestimate or underestimate the frequencies or their own abilities. So I think this is just an area for discussion about the nature of self-report data and the need for reliabilities on that. So the population of most interest in the study is adults with low skills, but findings are also reported for the general adult population, which I think is a real strength of the study. All data come from US adults in the 2012 and 2014 PIAAC studies. So, as I said, the behaviors that were focused on were all self-reported, and as I understand it, the PIAAC survey asked about the frequency of 4 writing behaviors. And for me, my background is in psychology, and I like to go to see what the actual items are. So I believe there were 4 behaviors: writing letters, memos, and emails, writing articles for newspapers, magazines, or newsletters, writing reports, and filling in forms at home and at work. So 2 of those behaviors would not be found too often among individuals with low skills, but yet they comprise this variable. So it's, again, something to think about. I know that you picked out the functional ones, but you also used all 4 for some of the analyses. Similarly, there were 8 reading behaviors: reading directions or instructions, reading letters, memos, or emails, reading articles in newspapers, magazines, or newsletters, reading articles in professional journals or scholarly publications, reading books, fiction or nonfiction, reading manuals or reference materials, reading bills, invoices, bank statements, or other financial statements, and reading diagrams, maps, or schematics. The reason I'm mentioning all this detail is, again, it's useful to think of what is reasonable to expect for individuals with low literacy to be able to do. And so there may be some floor effects here. I'm not sure about the data, but so there are 8 different reading behaviors there, and I think only a few of them would be used routinely, not only because of the skill level, but because of the types of jobs that people might get and the expectations in those jobs. I come from New York City, and we have a lot of people of Latino background working as doormen, which is maybe a New York thing. Well, I don't think they write memos, or many have low literacy skills because their background is, they just haven't gone that far in school, and they're tending the door of apartment buildings. I don't think they're going to be reading professional literature and journals in their jobs. So I have 1 minute, so I'll just say a few highlights here. There were many statistically non-significant correlations between home versus work reading and writing behaviors among adults with low skills, which I found very interesting because when I started reading this paper, I expected more of a flat pattern, that there'd be higher correlations across the domains and across the skills, but it didn't happen. So I thought that was very interesting and worth looking into. I see this study as providing a base for some very interesting hypotheses that could be tested in a more objective way, not using self-reports, but actually, doing some experimental work and possibly observational work just to verify the self-reports. I would also, I have a lot more to say, but I think I have 30 seconds left. But I think that for the paper, it's great that these papers are going to be in the public domain. And I think to make them, this one, which I read pretty carefully, accessible to policymakers, it would be really good to specify the literacy predictor variable to say exactly what was in it. That was not included in the paper. There was just a brief paragraph on that. So exactly what is this predictor variable and why it would be expected to predict the self-reported behaviors. So I think that would help not only form hypotheses but inform policymakers on how the data might be used in everyday contexts. So I just want to congratulate all the authors on this paper. It was a very carefully done study, and I do think that it could, if we think of a pathway, it could lead to hypotheses and intervention studies that would probably help adults improve their writing skills. So thank you.
And last we have Tom Smith and Cecil Smith.
So can you hang in for one more paper? So I'm Cecil Smith from West Virginia University, along with Tom Smith from Northern Illinois. I want to acknowledge the members of our research group that are here in the audience today, Anka and Jill, and I think that's Tobin back along the window. And you saw Tobin earlier today. I also want to point out, Tom mentioned to me this morning at breakfast that there's an error in our summary that's contained in your packet. So we're here in Washington, D.C. We're not really interested in proliferating fake news. So when you get to the policy implications part, just stop reading. We'll try to address some fact-based policy implications in the discussion part of our presentation. So our paper is about civic engagement, but I'm going to begin by talking about immigration. Immigration is an issue that, as you all know, has recently been a focus of a great deal of social and political concern, both in the United States as well as in a number of EU nations. And among the concerns are the perceived social and political problems that large-scale immigration is presumed to present within these countries. There's a persistent belief that many immigrants do not quickly assimilate into the communities in which they reside and become a part of the sort of overall fabric of the nation, the larger cultural makeup of the nation. And so we wanted to explore this issue through the lens of civic engagement to determine which background characteristics are associated with civic engagement, and if there are differences between native-born and immigrant adults in the extent to which they demonstrate civic engagement. Further, are there cross-national differences in these associations? We utilized Tom Ehrlich's definition of social engagement, which you can see here. And we view civic engagement as the practice of democratic participation. So we think it's a fairly important construct. From our synthesis of the literature, we operationalized civic engagement as a construct consisting of three variables from the PIAAC background survey: voluntary participation in voluntary work, political efficacy, and social trust. And social trust consists of two dimensions: the belief that you can really only trust a few people, and the belief that if you're not careful, other people will take advantage of you. Not any of you people, but other people. So we examined differences in civic engagement between native-born and immigrant adults, both in the United States and in Germany. Obviously, the U.S. and Germany share many nice characteristics. They're large, wealthy, and vibrant democracies. Maybe not so much lately in the United States. But they're both advanced, industrialized countries that have experienced large waves of immigration. But these two countries also differ in some important ways, having different educational systems, different paths to citizenship, and different ways of responding to immigrants and immigration. So we posed 2 research questions, which you can see here. The background demographic variables in our analyses: age, education, gender, employment status, number of years worked, the PIAAC skill proficiencies, and so on. These were used to determine the predictors of civic engagement, compare native-born adults to immigrants, and to compare the U.S. to Germany. And Tom is going to step up here and describe our statistical methods and results, and then I'll come back and talk a bit about what we think this all means.
Okay, so we were using for this analysis the 2012-2014 public use data file, and to answer our research questions, we did regression models treating our outcome variables as ordinal, as they indeed were, and predicting these ordinal indicators of civic engagement from immigration status, various participant demographic characteristics, and the PIAAC skill proficiencies. And then for research question 2, which involved looking at between country differences in these relationships, we used again a regression model treating these variables as outcomes, and specifically using a multi-group regression framework. So for research question 1, this is kind of what things look like. So we had civic engagement as the outcome here, and this was in each regression one of 4 different ordinal outcomes: volunteer work, political efficacy, and then the 2 trust variables, where the volunteer work was measured on a frequency from frequency scale. I think it was 5 points from never to every day, and then the political efficacy and the 2 trust variables were Likert items, degree of agreement items. And so volunteer work was more of a behavioral measure, and the other 3 measures were more attitudinal measures. And for research question 2, again, the same regressions, but done in a multi-group regression framework for both Germany and the US. And again, the same predictors in the same 4 outcomes. And so for our data analysis, we, of course, use the sampling weights and the replicate weights, and repeated the analysis using 10 cents of plausible values for the skill proficiencies, and the parameters were averaged. This became very tedious in the multi-group regression, because there's no, in R or M plus or any of the packages, a provision for doing testing full and constrained models with plausible values, and even the theory behind that is a little bit undeveloped. And so we carried this out using M plus, in fact. So for research question 1, and here I detailed things just diagrammatically, where the blue pluses are significant positive relationships, and the red negatives are significant negative relationships, and the light colored lines are the non-significant relationships. And the most notable results for research question 1 was that native-born status was a positive predictor of volunteerism. That is, people who were native-born were more likely or engaged in volunteer activities more than those who were non-native-born for the combined US and German sample. Age was a negative predictor of volunteerism. Females were more likely to volunteer than males. Those were the most notable. Education, as it is in many analysis, was a positive predictor of this outcome, as well as years of experience, and whether or not somebody was working negatively predicted volunteerism. And then for the skill outcomes, literacy was a positive predictor. Those we have to take with a little bit of grain of salt because those are highly correlated, so those regression estimates will be somewhat unstable. And then for research question 2, the effect of native-born status dropped out. It was no longer significant. Females were more politically efficacious than males, as occurred before, and education, again, positive, literacy positive, and age positive predictors of this outcome. For the first measure of trust, trust more than a few people, again, no difference between native-born and non-native-born persons. Now, no difference between males and females. Age is a positive predictor here, and education, as it consistently is, predicts this outcome. And then for the second trust variable, age, again, a positive predictor. This time, again, females more likely than males to believe that others won't take advantage of them. And education, again, a positive predictor. When we did the multi-group analysis, this was kind of interesting because for the volunteerism outcome, here, this native-born effect, where native-borns were more likely to volunteer than non-native-borns, was evident in Germany, but it was not evident in the US. So again, here I'm just highlighting the effects that were different between the two countries. The other effects may be significant, but there was no difference between the countries. But that was really the only difference between the two countries for the native-born, for the immigration status variable. When we looked at political efficacy, the two countries didn't differ in the effects of native-born status. There was a difference in the effect of being female, where in the US, females were more politically efficacious than males. And then, again, for native-born status, nothing for the second measure of trust, no effects of native-born status, no difference between the two countries, I should say, and no difference by gender. And I'm sorry, this was the second trust outcome. Once again, no difference between the two countries in the effects of native-born status, where there really was no effect, and no difference in the effect of gender.
So as Tom reported, several background variables predict the various dimensions of civic engagement, although none did so consistently or uniformly. Age, education, gender, and different skills predicted different dimensions of civic engagement. However, native-born status did not. There was no observed difference between native-born and immigrant adults for civic engagement, with one exception again. In Germany, immigrants were less likely to participate in voluntary work than the native-born. There were a few cross-national differences in the skills predictors of the social trust dimension. These differences, we think, might be due to differences in the two countries regarding how adults acquire and use literacy, numeracy, and digital skills. So we think that the finding of no difference between native-born and immigrant adults in civic engagement is both interesting and reassuring. It's interesting because it would seem to counter the myth that immigrants don't assimilate well or quickly, and it's reassuring that at least for civic engagement, immigrant adults are doing well in society and participating in civic activities, such as volunteer work in the US, similar to native-born adults. And they experience political efficacy and social trust equally to the native-born in both the US and Germany. These findings suggest that, again, at least for the US, policy efforts to promote social integration may be showing success, and I'll let Anke speak to possible policy implications in Germany. Overall, adults' literacy skills in particular are associated with 3 of the 4 dimensions of civic engagement that we examined, and numeracy and digital skills are associated with an attitudinal dimension of civic engagement, that is, social trust. It's interesting to us that skills are not associated with political efficacy. One would assume that those with higher skills might express higher political efficacy. We think also that efforts to improve adult skills might be necessary but not sufficient to increase civic engagement. policymakers can't assume that efforts to increase literacy or other skills will automatically increase civic engagement. Better skills may contribute to attitudes such as social trust, but better skills may not lead to changes in behaviors, such as participating in voluntary work. Finally, what seems important to us is that adults, regardless of their status as immigrants or native-born, regardless of their skills, have opportunities for civic engagement, where they're interacting with other people and fully participating in their communities. Thanks.
Definition of civic engagement that's used in PIAAC and therefore in the paper, and also on 3 issues that are positively associated with it: education level, skill level, and gender, since I can only talk for a couple of minutes. My thought was that we should look most closely at 2 of the 3 factors PIAAC uses to measure civic engagement: social trust and a sense of political efficacy. While every definition of civic engagement used also includes some aspect of voluntary work, it seemed to me that current definitions of civic engagement focus much more on more than whether you volunteer. It's having an interest in and being attentive to civic and political concerns. And so you really don't get at that with that particular variable. Since the PIAAC question on volunteerism defines it as any unpaid work, it doesn't in itself shed a lot of light on civic engagement. It would be interesting to know if engaging in voluntary work has a positive relation to a sense of political efficacy or to either dimension of social trust, but I didn't see that looking at those interactions in your study. We do see that several of the variables that are positively associated with voluntary work, education in both the US and Germany, and literacy skill in Germany, and female gender in the US but not in Germany, are also positively related to a sense of political efficacy in both countries. And that in addition, education is also positively associated with both aspects of social trust included in the study. So clearly, as the authors point out, an important takeaway from the study is that raising the education level of the population, of all the population, not just immigrants, is a critical factor in building social trust and a sense of political efficacy, which are 2 essential ingredients not only of civic engagement, but a sense of social cohesion, which is so critical right now. The fact that there is no difference between immigrants and native-borns on any aspect of civic engagement in the US underlines that importance of education. While there is that difference in Germany in the area of volunteer work, we don't really have enough information to understand the variables that explain this difference between immigrants and native-born in Germany. And since 65% of the population in Germany doesn't engage in volunteer work, and this is about the same percentage as have no more than a high school education, that just affirms, in my mind, the importance of education as a variable, as a critical variable. There are some intriguing aspects of this we might want to look at today in our discussion. In Germany, literacy skill is positively associated with both the sense of political efficacy and both aspects of social trust. And Germany, unlike the US, has a formal government-sponsored language learning and civic education requirement for all immigrants and paid for by the government as part of the process of becoming a citizen, whereas the US does not have such a formal system, although civic education is integrated into a lot of adult ESL courses. and it suggests that we probably might want to be doing something to formalize and expand resources for those programs in the U.S. And in the U.S., political efficacy is also associated with literacy skill, but the feelings that others won't take advantage of you is positively associated with numeracy, and the ability to trust more than a few people positively associated with PSTRE. I wondered if the link with PSTRE was related not just to the internet, which is something that you raise in the paper, but to the ability to effectively solve problems, since critical thinking and problem solving are important aspects of civic and political engagement. Similarly, I thought anecdotal evidence from literacy students suggests that feeling competent in dealing with finances increases one's sense that you won't be taken advantage of. And I wonder if this explains how these are connected in the US, and how we might learn more about how both of these skills contribute to a sense of social trust. I also kept wondering as I read the paper if looking at other variables in the background questionnaire having to do with skills used at work, with language, and with whether the respondent had children might shed some light on what predicts or is associated with increased civic engagement. I wondered why the authors didn't look at those factors. And just, my time's up, but I have to just say one more thing. The final issue I wanted to highlight is gender, of course. In this year of women's political activism, we are obviously not surprised by the association of female gender with voluntary work, a sense of political efficacy, or the belief that others won't take advantage of you. I'm curious about why these associations are persistent only in the US and not in Germany, and hope that some of you who have with a greater knowledge of gender relations in Germany will be able to shed some light on this. Thank you.